The hardware is working great. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Happy Wednesday. It's great to be here and to do another one of these. Our next event, just as some house cleaning, is we're most likely doing a Superset meetup November 10th with someone who's going to talk about how they've customized Superset internally in the organization, turning it into kind of an internal data platform. Pretty exciting. We're still finalizing the details. That's why the details are a little sparse, and I'm being deliberately vague until we've kind of figured out some of the structure and whatnot. But it should be second week of November. That'll be a meetup, so slightly different than a live demo, but similar. We'll still send out an announcement and a newsletter and advertise it on Slack and that type of thing. So look for that. And yeah, but for now, we'll get started. So I'll start by screen sharing. So today, what am I screen sharing? So let's start with the browser. Okay, cool. I hope everyone can see this. So today I'm going to talk about the Superset API. So this is mostly going to be an introduction, and I'll get to that in a second on some of the things that I'll cover, but I'm hoping to answer some of the questions people have had about authenticating and interacting with the API, some of the documentation, and basically go from there. So start things off, I always like to give an introduction to Superset. I know most people here are probably quite familiar with it, but there's always a few fresh faces, so it's always good. So Superset is an open source modern BI platform. It's built kind of using modern components, so Python for the back end and React and TypeScript for the front end. It's very modular and hoping to get even more modular in the coming months, so we can really evolve the project there. And it's open source, which is really exciting. A lot of people have built entire products on top of Superset. There's many people that just use it internally. It's a BI platform and everything in between. So it's been super cool to be part of the open source community here for the last 18 months personally. The goal is to really work with any SQL speaking data engine. This is facilitated through SQL Alchemy, which is kind of a nice, strong, somewhat of a standard for a lot of databases to target. In fact, just because of that standard, we recently have been working with Firebolt, and they just released a SQL Alchemy driver, and they were excited to do so specifically to work with Superset. Obviously, they can also get some other benefits out of it. It's used in a lot of analytical applications, but they specifically wanted to support Superset, so they found someone to build a SQL Alchemy driver for Firebolt. So really cool. They were able to do this in just a few weeks. And lastly, large diversity of charts. So there's over 60 chart types, and you can create your own. We're really hoping in the next few months to do a more in-depth event on creating custom Viz plugins. It's a lot of work. We've done one, I think, from Amit and Nielsen's team. They talk about how they manage and deploy custom Viz plugins, but there's still a lot more we'd like to do here, and it's also a personal interest of mine. How do we make it easier to support more Viz plugins? So that's a little bit about kind of the intro and the overview. So for an API, ultimately the real goal for Superset's API is to be able to interact with, so access, interact with, change, delete, update the internal data model. So for people who are not familiar, Superset has its own metadata layer. This is where all of the objects that are relevant for powering the application actually live. So things like databases, there's database object, things like connection strings, the password, username, how to access it, type of permissions, all that lives in the data model. Usually, if you're using Superset via Docker Compose, it's just going to be in Postgres. If you're using it via just like the pip native install, for example, it'll actually, I found this out the other day, it's going to be in a SQLite database that lives in your home directory, which is kind of cool. And you can change it out because again, it's using SQL Alchemy. You can actually, as long as you're using a SQL Alchemy compatible database, you can kind of switch where your metadata layer lives. and move it to the database of your choosing, which is just really cool. And so this is kind of an overview of these superset objects. Pretty much all these are exposed via the API, which is great. And yeah, so I think this is kind of some of the key ideas to understand. Because I think when you think about BI tool, it's very end user focused. You kind of think about user workflows and stuff like that. Ultimately, for an API, the real goal is to understand how you access and interact with the objects. And these are the kind of main keywords and things to look for when thinking about the Superset API. So you have things like data sets, you have saved queries. These are both important metaphors in Superset. You have charts. And so basically, it's the way it trickles down is you have dashboard objects at the kind of end of the funnel and the life cycle to some degree. Each dashboard can contain one or many charts. Each chart can live in multiple dashboards as well. So there's kind of an interesting many-to-many relationship there. Charts are powered by slices, which is kind of it's really like just a query as applied to a data set. That data set can be virtual or physical. Charts and data sets have kind of a many-to-many as well, except each chart is only linked to a single data set. And then each data set comes from a database. So that's kind of the data model. And that's really where a lot of people spend a lot of time interacting with the API. You also have other things like the annotation layer, CSS templates. You can schedule reports, look at the log, save queries, that type of thing. So what's the kind of outcome here? So the API is pretty complicated and pretty complex, really feature rich. My goal here is to really provide an introduction and follow up with events later on that go a little bit deeper and showcase more advanced workflows. And we're also hoping to create a series of blog posts at presets so people can really understand some of the recipes for the API. So this is really kind of an introduction, still an early effort. So the target audience really here is people who are new to Superset. So maybe you've joined Superset community and you've used the open source project just for a few weeks. You've heard that there's an API. And we do have pretty good documentation, but there are a few quirks. So I'm hoping to kind of showcase how to get that basic workflow going for people who want to hit the ground running here, but who are used to working with APIs. Second category are data folks that are comfortable with APIs. So I kind of identify as the second category, someone who likes getting things done with data. And it's nice to know that there is an API because you can do some cool things with it from a data standpoint. And lastly, just people interested in what the API could do. So to step back for a second, like what is the North Star for the API? And this is kind of important as you're looking at the changelog. Every time that there's a new version of Superset, you'll see specifically callouts to the API in many places. And especially if you look at the list of PRs. And so it can be tricky to know sometimes like where are these changes going? What's the North Star here? The short to medium term, it's how can the community, the committers, the contributors to the project make pretty much every end user and GUI based action available in the Superset API. So you can even imagine having a better interface for creating charts. So at some point, Superset could almost become more of a backend. And we've definitely I personally have spoken to organizations where that's kind of how they're using it. They actually don't use a lot of the cool GUI features. They're not using Explore and the no-code flow. They have kind of their own front end. They're using Superset more as a backend and a data access layer, which is super interesting and kind of, so it's kind of like a cool thing. I think that's kind of showing the power of open source. You can't really do this with a proprietary BI platform, for example. The longer term is, how can we turn Superset into a data product platform? And so that's kind of a phrase that some of the committers and contributors are starting to use more. You'll see it in more of the docs and blog posts, which is more than just a BI tool, but actually building all types of arbitrary internal data products, better supporting things like embedding dashboards and charts and in other applications. So that's kind of moving away from a traditional BI tool more into kind of a general platform. You need an API for that, so that's kind of the focus. So tech specs, so for people who like to geek out a little bit more, it follows the Open API specification and it's RESTful, so kind of following the standard practice nowadays. One of the really fun ways to kind of poking the API is just to pull up Postman or one of your favorite API investigation tools, and it'll just basically work right out of the box, which is great. It's built mostly using Flask App Builder, which is pretty interesting. It's something I've only learned in the last few months, kind of getting deeper into the code base. And so Flask App Builder is, for people who don't know, is kind of provides a scaffolding, a really thick scaffolding layer for anyone to build web applications quickly and have authentication and roles and permissions and an API. Just, it provides a framework for making that type of stuff very easy and very quickly. And Superset uses that under the hood. And so this actually means that some of the API documentation and lower level components for the API actually live in the Flask App Builder docs and website, which I'll get to in a second. So just a consideration, because we do have Superset API docs on the Superset site. It doesn't, unfortunately, at this time, contain everything that you need. I'm hoping the community will kind of work towards consolidating that, but they do live in kind of two different places to some degree. There's interactive Swagger documentation, which lives at the Swagger v1 endpoint. So I'll show this real quick. So this is Superset running. It's a super simple workflow. I just have Docker Compose. I pull down the latest branch, latest version of master, Docker Compose up. Once everything's done, you can go to /swagger/v1 and see the API. In fact, you can also authorize it. So you can, if you put in an auth token and all that, you can actually this is kind of like that Postman API investigation type of tool will be available right here in the browser. So that's pretty cool. So you can see all the routes here. You have annotation layers. You have the async events REST API. You have the cache REST API, which is pretty cool. Won't dive too much into it this time, but I'm hoping in our next time I do an intermediate focused API event, we can showcase some of the more robust strategies for invalidating cache. So you can imagine you have a data pipeline that finishes, or an Airflow job, whatever, and you then want to go and if you have kind of caching set up at the data set, the chart level and Superset, you want to go and make sure that those are invalidated. So when people are looking at dashboards and charts, they are looking at kind of more accurate data that's up to date. So that's kind of an important consideration. So charts, this goes back to that Superset object model I was talking about earlier. It has your standard routes. You can get specific chart information, export, import, that type of thing. CSS templates. So if you wanted to enforce kind of usage of certain CSS templates, I've spoken to at least 3 people in the community Slack who've asked about that. They want everyone to use the same template, and they want to kind of enforce it via the API. So that's kind of an important consideration. You have dashboard objects, databases, data sets, etc. So all this is kind of available. This is the same as the docs on the Superset docs website, except it's running locally. So that's going to be kind of the latest one, and it's linked to the version of Superset you're running. So if you go back in time to an older version, you know that you're going to see the docs that are relevant for you. So that's that. As I mentioned earlier, the goal of the API is to interact with the underlying data model and the metadata layer in Superset. It's not to interact with Superset directly, which is an important nuance. The goal is not to kind of act like a robot that is going to the BI tool, the BI layer, and simulating human action. That's not really the goal. You're probably better off using something like Selenium or another kind of web driver scraping oriented library for that type of thing. The goal is really to change the underlying data model and metadata. And so there's some important considerations there to think about when you're designing how you're going to use APIs with Superset, because if you are kind of fighting for a conflict over the data model along with your end users, that could lead to a poor experience for end users. By end users, I mean analysts and data scientists that are actually working, most likely with the UI. They're going to feel some resource contention and some data model inconsistencies if you're kind of using the API in the same way. And it supports a RISON or JSON, RISON being kind of a more human URL-friendly version of JSON. Some API use case. Some of this I kind of covered in my Airflow Summit talk, but I'm not going to assume everyone came to that. So some common workflows that we've seen is using these type of routes to the chart data cache key. There's a cache key for the data set level as well. So you can use this to invalidate the cache, as I mentioned earlier. So if you know that your data pipe is hooked in, it has tendrils in your Superset deployment, you can invalidate the cache strategically in kind of this nice way. Import and export dashboards, which is really powerful. This is there's not really there are version control workflows in Superset, but they are a little bit hacky. It's through things like the API, or using the CLI commands, which I'll mention later. You can create new databases. You can return select star from a database table, schedule new reports. So these are all kind of common use cases. And we've even seen some organizations have a Superset deployment that actually doesn't really have many users at all. It's kind of the only user is the admin that's created from the API. So they have the entire instance for a kind of a BI experience that is completely computer controlled and code controlled. So in areas where that type of accuracy and you have very highly sensitive data and you really don't want your users to be mucking around, but you want them to get insights, this is kind of a use case there. So first things first, authenticating with API. This is something that it's not in the docs right now, which we're hoping to fix. So I have this Jupyter Lab notebook open. I was hoping to demo some of this so people can get a sense for how this actually works. So notebooks are great because I can just kind of step through the code and the state and the data, and it's easy for people to follow along, which is great. So here I'm just using Python requests, which is my library of choice, but you can really use anything. You don't even need to use Python because it's an API. So all we're doing is we're starting with the base URL here. First things first is authenticating with the API. So the tricky thing here is you do need the first thing when I opened the API docs is, well, how do I authenticate? And that took a little bit of investigation, but the way to do this is actually by going to the Flask App Builder documentation, FAB. So here you'll see information about what happens when you try to access it directly, right? So if you don't make that JSON web token first, then you're going to run into an error. Yeah, you'll see this right here. So this is private, right? So then you first need to send a post request and get a token. And then once you have a token, you can use it in all of your future requests. Pretty standard, but always good to cover. So if you're using in a local Superset deployment, it's just a simple username and password. You can also put the provider, which is the database. And I won't cover it this time, but there is a way to use it with OAuth as well, which needs some better documentation. But a lot of people use Superset via OAuth, so being able to use an OAuth key is important here. But here you can see we just send the payload. We do a post request to API/v1/security/login, and we get the token that we need, convert it to JSON, and there we go. We get this kind of jumbled string, which is how most of these tokens look like. And then the way to actually use this in your request is to put it in your header. So I have a separate dictionary right here for authorization bearer. I put the access token. Again, not too crazy and kind of somewhat common for API. So I have a screenshot there. So next, let's get some things, right? So if you look here, what's the first thing I do? I get some charts. So we can go down here. We can see chart. We can see the chart endpoint and send it along. So I just call this R2. We use the request library. We do a get request. In this case, instead of post. And then the key thing here is to make sure you pass in the headers. So you need to pass in this dictionary right here, which then gets stringified and sent over the wire and saved here. I saved it as JSON. If you want to mess around with the API and you're a Jupyter Notebooks geek like myself, I do recommend, by the way, installing, or not installing rather, using Jupyter Lab. This is not supported in Jupyter Notebook for some reason, but in Jupyter Lab, Jupyter Lab, you can use the IPython.display. You use the JSON function from IPython.display, and what it does is it turns this into an interactive session. So now you can, instead of just seeing this kind of long list of JSON results, you can actually get a prettified and minimizable and searchable version. So this is really nice for your, I use this heavily to learn about the different kind of API options quickly. So you have your root here, you have the nesting. It shows you how many results are returned. And the interesting thing is that this matches actually what's shown here. So it said 114. No surprise. That's also what the API says. And by default, it's ordered by the order that you see when you open the charts tab, which is, I believe, by last modified. So this hexagon one this is considered more recent, just because it's actually a null value, but that's just how the ordering works. So what's interesting is that when you're again getting familiar with the API, you can just go to the matching UI and see the same thing returned in the same order from the API. So when you hit charts with the get request, you'll see the same results. So you can see here we have the label column. So this is a way of it's kind of the data dictionary basically. And this is also, if you want to get specific values, you can use the Rison syntax. That's also covered it's not in the Superset docs, but it is here in the Flask App Builder docs. So you can use this type of notation to grab specific information quickly in your code. And then you can see it is pagination. So you'll see that we have 114 objects, but only 20 are returned at a time. And then this is kind of all the information that powers Superset. So this is actually what is needed to just run the project. So you'll see information about who changed it. You'll see that person's URL. You'll see created by data source ID. So these IDs are useful if you want to get more. So you can imagine the type of joins you can do for each chart. You're getting the data source ID, and then you can use all those relevant routes. You can also do interesting things like get all the charts and then try to understand which data sources are used the most. So you kind of build that histogram as a dictionary, and then you go and make the request that you need to the datasets API, and then you can kind of get the information on the datasets themselves and make a little histogram. I am hoping at some point to do a Superset dashboard using the Superset API, so that would be a cool follow-up as well. Can you understand the usage of Superset using Superset? Would be kind of a cool, recursive thing to do. The params, so this is for the chart type, all the parameters that are kind of specified by the user and are created in the Explore view are available here. So you can imagine that these, using post instead of get, you can actually modify these values instead. So if you wanted to, as I mentioned earlier, enforce a certain type of CSS style, or even create charts from scratch in a programmatic way, it's a little bit tricky to do, like sitting just in code and trying to design a chart in JSON it's not something I recommend, but it is something that is technically possible in the UI, via the API, and of course the viz type, etc. So all this information that you're getting, you can kind of turn around and also update, overwrite, that type of thing. So you have the post here. You can also specify the query context, that type of thing. And this is the same information except just in this non-JSON UI. So the same thing works for dashboards, right? In this case, we're using the base URL. I do recommend just having a separate base URL variable. Then you can just have that. It's pretty common practice. One thing you might run into is that depending on how you have, there is a config setting somewhere, but by default, the refresh for the token is somewhat aggressive. I think even now, we may or may not, let's see. Oh, it looks like it worked. But I think after about 5 or 10 minutes, you need to re-auth and get a new token. So one thing that's been talked about is the development of a Superset client library so that it's kind of just handled for you. And there's kind of a method for just automatically re-authenticating every time. Because I'm in a notebook, I just scroll up, run this cell again, get the token, and then since it's just a variable reference, it'll use the new token, no problem. So same thing here, get list of dashboards. You're gonna get the column names, you're gonna get and then you're gonna get each of the results. So it's basically just a list of objects. In this case, I only have 11 dashboards. in my instance, and it has a ton of kind of data. This is the COVID vaccine dashboard that ships with Superset by default. So there's all kinds of information on both the metadata that exists at the dashboard level, and then like position JSON. So where is each chart live? So you can also imagine, again, you can use the API to make new dashboards. It's a little bit wonky because you're kind of working in the dark a little bit and hoping that you're creating a dashboard that you want. But just to kind of showcase that it is technically possible. If you have the thumbnail set up via the separate Selenium driver, you can also get URLs. So you can imagine people who are using Superset more as a backend but want to show the thumbnails, they can kind of use this. I do not have a thumbnail set up locally, so this URL actually will not work. And you'll also get the URL. So if you wanted to build some type of data discovery type of thing, this is what actually Lyft's Amundsen project. They have a Superset integration. If you search Lyft Amundsen Superset, you'll see that they use the API a lot to be able to track the lifeline of data from kind of Airflow, if you're using Airflow, all the way to dashboards. So pretty interesting. And yeah, this is just an example of what specific JSON metadata looks like for a dashboard. And yeah, so same as kind of before. The other thing I wanted to mention is there is a CLI as well for Superset. What I will do is actually switch to my CLI. So here I have Docker Compose. It's running it's running Redis, it's running the Python backend, it's running the front-end web server. The neat trick here is that if you have it running in one tab, you can just do a Docker PS, get the name of the container, then do Docker exec-it and put in the container name and do sh at the end, and it'll fire up the shell. And so this is a good way to get into the context and kind of the mind of one of the containers. And then what I've done right here is just run superset -- help. So this will show you all the CLI commands that are available. And so, for example, this is one of the things I demoed in my Airflow Summit talk is, at that time, this was an open PR. This is now since merged. It's not in a versioned release, so you have to be running master to get this. But this actually unlocks a new command via the Superset CLI called import -directory. And so you can export kind of a dashboard bundle and then delete that dashboard and all the kind of relevant metadata and charts and stuff like that. And then use this CLI command instead of the API to actually just point it to the folder, and then it will import it directly into the Superset metadata layer. If you want a demo of this working, I can link to my Airflow Summit talk where I show it off. It's pretty straightforward. You will need version to export the version export flag running so that it exports not a single JSON file, but actually a gzipped folder. And then you just unzip that and put the entire thing. So last thing, documentation. As I mentioned, there's two areas that are important. And we'll share the slides out for people that are curious. So the Flask App Builder is I need to switch screens actually. So let me switch over to my browser again. So the Flask App Builder, this is what Superset uses as the backend, as I mentioned. So if you go here to just the flask-appbuilder.com/read the docs, you'll see a section on the REST API, and you'll see all the kind of information I talked about. It also talks about if you're curious about, if you're forking Superset or you want to customize some of the routes as well, I highly recommend reading these docs because they provide a lot of context into how Superset interacts with Fab to make this happen. And yeah, it talks a lot about some of the philosophy, the model REST API, talks about Swagger. So in theory, any app you build on Fab will have the same type of graphical representation. So this is something I recommend. And as I mentioned, these Superset API docs as well, generated by Swagger, are also really useful, mostly for discovering the actual routes. And to kind of, you can also test sample queries here, sample API requests, which is great. So use this a bunch to get more familiar with the API. So that's kind of the main things I wanted to cover. It's really an introduction. I'm hoping to release a blog post with the same context kind of early next week. So for people who want to follow along more tightly, there'll be a blog post out on the preset blog. And then, as I mentioned, in the coming months, we'll follow up with deeper, more intermediate and advanced tutorials and just showcase more of the recipes that we can do. So hope this was helpful. Happy to answer any questions now. So let's see. Andrew Scarani asks, is this accessible via preset? Yep, this is available in preset. If you go to docs.preset.io, you'll see the API. There's an API article for it. And there's also preset specific APIs that are, that for our unique user management layer. But honestly, anyone who's deploying Superset, as long as they haven't restricted the API, it should work. Q&A, Robert asked, could you please share your Docker compose.yaml? I happily share it, Rob, but it's actually the same as, it's just a default one from the Superset repo. So I'm happy to, if you want to DM me in the Slack, I can share it with you, but it's just the default one in the repo. I'm not doing anything special yet. If you have any issues, post that in the community. Robert asks, are the dashboards able to auto refresh? Yes and no. No, because it's not. This is one of the kind of challenges with the API and the end user model, which is if you make changes to your data model, unless the user refreshes on the front end or the clients, any type of client is refreshing, they will not get the new state. So this is one of the challenges, and this is why there's not that tight coupling yet. I'm hoping that eventually there might be, but for now, as I mentioned, like the API is really like putting your tendrils into the data directly, skipping the UI flow. So that is one thing that can lead to a slightly disjointed experience. If you were deploying Superset, you have hundreds of users, that type of thing. So something to keep in mind. But by yes, I meant that you can set a very short refresh interval. So caching kind of exists at both the chart level and the dataset slice level. The dataset level and then the chart slice level. So they exist in two places. You just go to edit properties and you can set it to the number of seconds. So you can set it to like 1 second if you want. But again, it's still the user refreshing the page, not kind of automatically. Euclides asks, implementation of Superset metrics API endpoint. Make the Superset observable. There is a logs endpoint. I'm not that familiar with it, to be completely honest. That might be a good candidate for a follow-up piece of content. But yeah, you can use the logs endpoint. You can also just kind of hook up observability tools. I mean, the thing to keep in mind is Superset at the end of the day is just another web app. So any of the other web apps that you're used to instrumenting and monitoring, it kind of works the same way. So some people use Datadog, like we use Datadog at Preset, for example. And so you can observe your application that way. It's pretty standard. And I think that's still probably the best way, is to treat it like another web app that you're deploying in your infrastructure. Alfonso asks, in a client like a React application, the JSON Web Token is not enough if public role do not have access to the data. How should it be done? How should the auth be done? This is a question I've seen multiple times. I will say I haven't worked too much with public Superset applications. So I recommend asking in the embedded Superset channel or posting in the GitHub repo. It's a good question. I unfortunately just do not know the answer. I know there's some complexity there in the interaction between creating a public YAML role and how do you also make sure that people can access the data. So I don't have a great answer, unfortunately. Suckdevel asks, is there a way to download the rendered image using dashboard and chart APIs? The closest is the thumbnail. So as I mentioned earlier, there is, if you manage to get the thumbnails working in your Superset deployment, then it at least, and you set it up so it takes snapshots in certain intervals. So I think you can set it up to take a snapshot upon the data state change. So then if that's the case, you can use that screenshot API, the thumbnail API. That's probably the best you can do for now. But in terms of, it's not going to be kind of full rendered. Like if you want like the raw SVG that's being rendered, that's not, as far as I know, that's not possible right now. So that's something you'll have to. One workaround you could do is that every chart has kind of a URL that the API will give you. You can always write a little Selenium script that will go and then kind of grab the image and download it. That's probably the best way right now. So it's kind of it's a little bit of a hack, but there's no way right now to grab the image. Showbuckler asks, can I integrate my custom connectors for a database? Yeah, I mean, basically all you need. So if you, I've actually written about this. There's a database connectors. So I have a blog post that I wrote called Building New Database Connectors for Superset. You can just Google it and then you'll find it, or just go to the preset blog and you can just search for it there. So here I talk about what are the requirements. So I kind of chronicle CrateDB, which is a database that I had never used, but they had a SQL Alchemy driver. I just needed to make sure that the driver was in the same Python context that Superset was running in, and then make sure that there was database engine spec. So those are really the two requirements. Is you just need to go here, make sure that, let's say you have a new database called SriniDB. You just need to make srinidb.py, and you need to put it, and then you need to make sure that that library is installed in the same context. And that's pretty much all you need. So as long as you have access to your Superset deployment, you can change the library that's to the Python libraries that are installed in the same Superset Python context, and you know how to create a database engine spec. And some of them are pretty minimal, like this Databricks one is just a few lines of code. As long as you know how to do that, you can deploy any of your custom code, custom databases. Let's see, in the Q&A tab, I just a clarification, there's questions in both the Q&A and the chat. If you can use the Q&A tab, that'd be great, because I can just look in one place. I will look at the chat tab afterwards. So that's that. So let me close some of these questions so that I could see. Can the PowerPoint be shared? Yes. Darun asks, can the PowerPoint be shared? I will share these slides when we send out the recording to everyone who confirmed attendance to this event. The recording will be on YouTube and the slides will be in that email. The slides will also be in the YouTube description. So there's two places. If you still don't get the email or you can't find it, reach out to me in the Superset Slack and I will send it to you. So clearing out some of the questions that we've answered. Kokila asks, is it possible to have custom authentication? If so, with custom UI? Yeah, so for example, at Preset, we have a team that has built its own, what we call Preset Manager. So it's the user manager layer, and it's completely, it's just completely different. So if I go to, so this is an in-house application that we've built, but again, anyone can build this. This is, this has role-based access control and teams and workspaces, that type of thing. This is only in Preset. I know, I believe Airbnb in their deployment has their own version as well. So with authentication in Superset, it works using Flask App Builder. It supports things like OAuth, LDAP, that type of thing. So Flask App Builder is the main documentation I would read here. The Superset docs also cover a little bit as well, but unfortunately, I will full disclosure, I'm not an expert on the authentication side. So I would ask some folks in the community and check out the docs. It's probably where I would start. Taylor asks, we want to serve Superset instances to multiple clients and only deploy dashboards that are purchased to each client. Exercising the API, I'm having issues importing dashboard from our source environment to a target environment. How do I get to better error understanding that the API is currently giving me of an undescribed error? That's a good question. I would definitely open a GitHub issue with this so that the core kind of committers and engineers can respond. And I think frankly, there is more work to be done in with regards to the developer experience and the API experience. And if you're interested in contributing, I would also kind of pitch that in the Slack and the GitHub so that it is an open source project. So I think we all need to do a better job kind of figuring out how to improve that as well. So regarding the API, I mean, as I mentioned, the superset, the command that Beto created is what I would recommend actually instead of the API. So this is the import directory command. So you can take any kind of bundle of metadata assets, put it in a directory, and then import it, and using the CLI. And I would say if you have access to the API, I'm guessing you also have access to the CLI as well. So this probably is the better way to do it. Yeah, but there are some limitations. I would say that like this is kind of what I mentioned earlier about the North Star, but the longer term being turned Superset into a data product platform. There's still kind of more work to be done there so that it can have a much better experience. Where it's very much a Superset BI platform. It's still kind of a BI platform, not a data product platform. So. Is the Slack developer has a follow-up question on thumbnail API? Is it equivalent to the download option in the UI? It is not. It's definitely not as good. I would say it's just something. But yeah, this is still where there's a gap. This is still the gap in the API. Not everything that you can do in the front end is available in the API. If you're interested in contributing that functionality, reach out or post in the contributing channel, and I'll try to get the attention of other folks that are interested in working on this. But yeah, as it stands right now, it's not. Anonymous attendee asks, are there high-level endpoints for bringing up entire chart creation workflow UI component rather than having to create it by calling lots of low-level endpoints? No, not right now, unfortunately. But that's kind of like what's still missing, and that's what needs to happen in the longer term. Right now, you have to do these low-level kind of operations, and it's a little bit painful. So right now, it's still kind of expected that people will use Superset and explore the UI to build things. Eventually, it would be great if that wasn't the case, but it isn't right now. So if you're interested in that, like definitely open up a GitHub issue and like let's get a discussion going there in the Slack and in the GitHub, because it would be great to have different front ends for Superset at some point. Abdullah asks, will we see the drill down features soon? It's a good question. I believe drill down is still in the POC stage. I know that some of the engineers at Preset that are also on the PMC for Superset, they are hoping to release it sometime before the end of the year. But that's unfortunately all I know right now. So in the coming months, hopefully it'll be there, and then maybe a few weeks after that into a stable version release. So I hope that answers your question. Karen Raj asks, if we add a new schema to a database, it is not showing in the database list. We are creating a new database again. Is there any API to refresh the database? I do not think there is an API to force refresh. Unfortunately, that's probably a bug. So I would open a GitHub issue, put your version, put screenshots, put as much information as you can. It should be updating. So that sounds like a bug, and so the community should try to fix that at the code level. Mark asked, what is the preferred workflow to refresh the cache instead of just invalidating it? That's a good question. I would say the caching mechanism and the strategy for Superset is still pretty nascent, or in the sense of how much you really want to control. So I would say that right now the cache, as I mentioned, like a lot of people use the caching layer, and it lives at they use it specifically around data sets. So if you have a view, like a Superset view that's joining 4 tables or something, then you can either set it as a time-based interval in the UI, or you can what you can do is set the refresh to be basically never refresh. You can just remove that value entirely, and only let your code or your data pipeline or whatever you're using for the data stack, like, only allow that to update the cache. So yeah, so when you invalidate it, it should. That's a good question. I think when you invalidate, it does re-trigger the underlying query. But I think we need to follow up there. I'm actually not 100% sure there. You're right that just invalidating it may not be super useful, because if you have a dashboard and then if the first time, if you have to wait till someone hits that dashboard and all those charts and all those data sets need to be, unless someone hits it, it's not going to be requeried. That's not ideal either. So I'm not 100% sure, unfortunately. Sorry. Sukhbir asks, can you share your notebook? Yes, happy to share my notebook. It's pretty basic, but I will include that in the email that we send out, as well as the YouTube. Anonymous attendee, how can we use API to get the top end queries per user per dashboard? Yeah, I don't think that's possible right now. Because I would first say that, like, this may be better done by your database, to be honest. Like, it's not the goal of any BI tool in this kind of front end layer for data is not to be a performance diagnostics tool. So I will say that in general, it may be a while, or possibly never, before that type of real profile performance optimization is really there in Superset. But what you can do, probably the best thing you can do, as I mentioned, there is the data from the API. You can figure out the queries for virtual data sets that are done, or you can just figure out from using the dashboard API which data sets are queried, and then you just need to cross-reference that directly with data coming out of your database. It's a little bit hacky, but I will say it is a little bit like unfortunately most BI tools do not offer these type of diagnostics. I don't see that changing anytime soon, especially because a lot of people have 10, 20, 30 different databases that they're using, and they all kind of give different information. I also don't think Superset is actually storing a lot of information about things like how long queries take and the performance, and the kind of making it easy for you to compile those stats anyway. So, but definitely, if that's something you're interested in, like, open an issue, let's get a discussion going and see how many other people have that interest. But as it stands right now, there's not a super great way. Tarun asks, is it possible to have two types of authentication in Superset, like having both AuthDP and AuthLDAP? I think so, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm not super familiar with the low-level auth stuff in Superset, so I'm probably not the best person to answer that. Can we get the Zoom recording? Yep, as I mentioned, we will send out an email that'll be on YouTube. Philip asks, can we upsert an existing dataset's column and descriptions without losing manually added calculated columns and metrics of this dataset? That's a good question. Let's see if we can figure that out from the API. I've never done that. I know there has been some talk about using dbt to update, or rather to have Superset better reflect the information in dbt models and post dbt transform. Let's look at the dataset API. Where is it? I wish this was alphabetized. Here we go. Probably post, create. No, we don't need post. I think we actually need put. Get. Is there no put? Here we go. Dataset put. Change the dataset. Overrides columns. I think this should work. That's a good question. We are running a little low on time. Let's follow up in the Slack. I think it should be technically possible. There's no columns endpoint. You're right, Philip, but there is in dataset. You can see that there's column name right here, and this is in the put request. So columns, you pass in a list, and you can give it a bunch of information. So it should be possible. I also did have a meeting once with MetriQL, which is building an open source metrics layer, and they have this working. So also something we can follow up on. They're working on a blog post showcasing MetriQL with Superset, and this is exactly what they do. MetriQL is the metrics layer. they're using MetricQL to update information in Superset and keep Superset aware of updates there. So that's kind of more or less what they're doing. So it should be possible. Drew Goal asks, I've used Superset Docker image and tried to use SQL Alchemy connector. Unable to do that. Yeah, that's a good question, Drew. This is a common thing. So if you want to connect into a this is not a superset issue, so I'll quickly answer by saying there's a way you need to understand how the networking works. So if you have your MacBook, for example, or whatever laptop you're using, you have your Docker containers. They live on different networks, but there are bridges. And so one common thing is if you Google connecting, to a port from inside of your Docker container, there is a a Docker namespace that they've created called, I think it's docker.for.internal.host. If you search that, you should be able to find, there's basically, just like localhost, they've created this little word that maps into Docker, the internal Docker network. So that way you can refer to that string :8080, and that'll get the same thing as the 8080 port within Docker. I would Google around. There's a ton of blog posts about this. It's more of a Docker networking thing than a superset thing. So I will move on. Kokila asks, is it possible to change dimension positions automatically using API? Theoretically, yes. It is kind of painful. You have to use the dashboards API for this and do a bunch of put requests. As I mentioned, it's not ideal. I would really recommend using the UI instead. I think you can imagine a developer experience down the road where as you're making these type of changes and iterating via the API, you're actually able to get feedback and data. So like you can imagine a notebook that's actually showing the state, but in a visual way. But right now it is technically possible, but it is a little painful and low level. Anonymous asks, I felt GitHub issue is not being looked at by the community. I believe they're important. What is the best practice to get issue noticed by the community? I don't have a good answer for you there, unfortunately. This is one of the realities of an open source community. There's 41,000 stars. And so there's tons of people that have used Superset in some way. There's 5,000 people in the Slack. There's just a lot of issues. And then now we crossed the 1,000 issue threshold on GitHub. So unfortunately, it's just, this is a reality of open source. It's not a paid product. It is open source community. So if no one has commented on the issue, that unfortunately that means that it's possible others may not have the same issue or it's not as important for them. That's a reality. One of the ways a lot of people do get influence, and open source usually rewards these, especially Apache projects, is you contribute. So if you contribute and offer to fix some of these issues yourself or fix other issues, that's also a way to eventually become a committer and have more outsized say. But that is kind of one of the challenges of being in this type of purely democratic type of thing, which is not all voices are elevated, unfortunately. Abdullah asks, can you share notebook and slide? Yes, we will share the notebook and the slide as part of the recording email that goes out as well. Vince asks, we need to programmatically create custom user roles and provision into Superset instances with these roles. How would we go about invoking the Fab APIs? Are we better off accessing the Postgres database instead? You can use the Superset CLI for this, actually. So in general, I recommend, you'll notice that there is an API security endpoint, but it's pretty simple. It's for like logging in. The Superset CLI events is the main way to do this. I would look at the code for like load examples, for example. You'll see that's all done via the Superset CLI. So the Superset CLI is how I would actually do it. And the CLI commands will invoke Fab as needed underneath. But I don't even know if this is possible via REST. I think all the user management stuff actually happens in the CLI. So can you use DVC with Superset? Dhruv, I don't know what DVC is. But yeah, I would Superset will work with any SQL Alchemy compatible database. So if there's a SQL Alchemy driver, then you'll be good to go for the most part. We have just a few more minutes, so I'll quickly answer these. How can I add custom views and links to Superset menu? Srinivas asked, same name as me actually. Custom views, you'll need to modify the front end. So if you go to Superset repo and then you go to the folder Superset-front end, you'll need to modify the front end there. And then if you need backend routes, then you need to look at the backend code. So it's a full stack web application. So It kind of follows the usual web application patterns there. It's not something I've done, unfortunately. So, but that is the general way to approach this. Anupriya asks, is there an API change positions, dimensions? I actually already answered this. There is a way via the dashboard's endpoint, but it is kind of painful. So I don't really recommend it. Has Superset folder structure in UI? Yeah, there isn't right now. I would open an issue. I know this is something that's been discussed by a few people. Like, can be nest, data sets and dashboards. But right now, there's no folder structure, unfortunately. Throwing as an organization, we're trying to migrate. One thing I've observed is we can't dump all the metadata from 0.27. Yeah, that's you can't migrate directly. I think you need to upgrade to each version. So 0.27, and then I guess there's might be 0.28. That's a big change. And this is kind of a common challenge with any open source project that's moving quickly, is that maintaining backwards compatibility is very, very hard. There is an update.md file in, I think it's resources in Superset, or it's just in the main top folder. So you probably want to go version by version so that every version introduces new database migrations and they migrate. And then you'll want to do the version. As I mentioned, there is a version to underscore export flag. So we have a feature flags.md. You can follow up with me in the Slack if you want. There's a feature flags.md file which showcases one of the flags about version to export. So I think probably starting at 0.36 or 0.37, there's version to export. So if you migrate to a later version, if you upgrade version by version to a later version, then you do a version to export. The bundle of gzipped files you get there will be more friendly to import into 1.3, for example. I'll quickly look at the chat. Please share the recording. Yes, we'll share the notebook. We'll share all of this. And can we get documentation on API? Yeah, as I mentioned in the talk, Balakrishnan, it is, if you go to superset.apache.org and then go to documentation and then go to API, you'll see, like, here it is right here, but also it runs at wherever you're running Superset, that URL +/swagger/v1. And then there's also the fab documentation. All these are linked to from the slides, which I will also share as well. We're at time. Thanks everyone for coming. I hope this was somewhat useful. If you have more ideas for kind of future events, or if you want to give your own event, please reach out to me on the community Slack, and I'd love to have more people present the work that they've done. And I hope this was helpful, and we will share the recording and the notebooks and the slide as well. So thanks again. Have a good rest of the day.